Exploited, the Cyber Truth, a podcast by RunSafe Security.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Exploited, the Cyber Truth. And our topic this week is Security Without Code Changes, a Path Forward for FDA Compliance. I am Paul Ducklin, joined by Joe Saunders, CEO and founder of RunSafe Security. Hello Joe, welcome back.
Welcome, thank you.
And we have Phil Englert, who is VP of Medical Device Security at Health-ISAC. Hello Phil, great to have you.
Thanks for having me on, Paul. Good to meet you, Joe.
Now, for those who don't know what ISAC means, it's short for Information Sharing and Analysis Centre. So Phil, you're an industry body, a global industry body for the health sector, and you are all about sharing and community action to make cybersecurity a better thing for everybody, aren't you?
Yeah, so our whole purpose is to create mechanisms for our members, and there's 900 member organizations. We like to say you have 12,000 analysts working for you, but they share InfoSec information across the healthcare sector, whether that's manufacturers, big pharma, healthcare delivery organizations, HIEs, the health information exchanges, or the software manufacturers, the EHR companies. If we can share information often and early, we believe we can help our members defend, detect, and respond in a much more rapid manner.
And indeed, things that happen in one part of the healthcare industry can have dramatic and devastating effects on other parts, even in ways that the average person probably doesn't think. And an example that we were speaking about before the podcast was, I believe it was a blood bank in New York that was unable to process blood to give to people having surgery or accident victims because the labeling company had been hit by a cyber attack.
Yeah, so it was the labeling machines in the labs. They couldn't ship any of their blood products. I don't think the labeling machines were targeted as such. I think they were caught up because they were vulnerable, because they're IoT devices that didn't have the security controls that you would hope to be present on them.
Yes, because you think, oh, it's a labeling machine. Like, how hard can it be? I've got a label printer at home.
And who would want to hack it?
But, if you're about to receive blood from somebody else, it's rather important that there's no mix-up. Phil, perhaps you can say something about how the issues concerning the security of medical devices, and in particular complying with FDA regulations for medical devices, has evolved and changed over your extensive experience in the industry.
When I was servicing med devices, cybersecurity was not a concern. As a matter of fact, things like cardiac packs was a server underneath the cardiologist's desks. Physiological monitoring systems, there was one for each department, and it was not connected beyond the equipment closet at the end of that department. So we've connected these devices for a number of reasons: for building efficiency, operating efficiency within healthcare, for collecting the information and being able to show accountable care improvement. And if you think a medium-sized hospital, let's say 300 beds in the United States today, will produce about 1.37 terabytes of data a day.
A day?
It's crazy. And a lot of it comes off of the extraordinary diagnostic imaging that we can do today.
Right.
We've painted a large target on our back because there's patient data in there. And we have, in the United States, we have the HIPAA regulations. When they first came out, were to foster data exchange between entities. If you leave your job and go to another job, if you leave your care provider and go to another care provider, that information can be shifted. That was the impetus for HIPAA. We realized that in sharing that data, we created a lot of security risks around protecting that data as well. And a few years later, we came out with the high-tech rules, which were very similar from a technology perspective to PCI. We're exchanging data. We just need to protect the transactions and the data en route and on the endpoints. So when a healthcare organization gets breached, their first mission is to restore services.
There are some very specific regulations in healthcare from the FDA, aren't there, that mean that the attitude that we take towards updating things like mobile phones, or as Joe and I like to talk about, web apps, which you can literally do between one web visitor and the next, that kind of let's just patch it and see does not exist in the medical profession, does it?
So it doesn't broadly exist. I won't say that it doesn't exist at all. I think we're beginning to develop these techniques that allow us to update on the fly and update at a much more rapid rate. But for a lot of legacy devices and devices that were not designed to be updated, that is a challenge.
Joe, this is reminiscent of a talk we had in an earlier podcast, isn't it? Where you were talking about a very, very simple kind of device, such as an actuator that operates a valve for flood defenses or something like that, where the device has exactly one function and it must perform it exactly correctly every time within a certain period, with no, it's going to take a little bit longer this time. It's the same sort of problem, isn't it? That changes might feel necessary, but at the same time they bring a risk.
Absolutely. And we obviously realize that medical devices need to be reliable. They need to be rugged to withstand the conditions. And also they have to last for a long time because healthcare systems and providers are making investments in the technology, and they need to use that technology over a good extended period of time. There are hundreds of millions of outpatient visits. There's hundreds of millions, if not billions, of physician office visits. There are billions of prescriptions. And, let's face it, the healthcare industry in general is one of the major sectors in our economy and is very vital to the well-being of our society. And so if you think about the importance of making sure medical devices operate normally and reliably, given all the use and given all the conditions in which they operate, safety is, obviously paramount for such devices, and working in ways where they're reliable from the start. So there's good reason to have organizations like FDA and others making sure that medical devices meet certain standards and regulations.
So in a world of that sort, if you need to retrofit additional security and safety to devices that aren't likely to get changed out for another 5, 10, maybe even 15 years, how can you remain compliant with strict regulations about correctness without rewriting the code entirely or without starting afresh?
I mean, from my perspective, building security into the products before, say, a product hits the US market, and having a process to do that. And certainly then as a result of that, you want to have ways to make sure those devices remain resilient and have security built in. And so I do think having a forward-thinking software development process that not only meets the standards of the known vulnerabilities, but having security built in so that it withstands any future disclosures of vulnerabilities on such devices. So there's certainly ways to do that in the software development process, and certainly identifying all the components that go into a medical device are important. But I'm sure we'll get into many more of those details as we keep talking.
When we use a term like security without code changes, what mitigations can you apply?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, right? One, in today's litigious world, healthcare providers, device owners are not in a position to re-engineer a device. But as a healthcare provider, where I go is compensating controls. If this control is not available, what can I do in my environment to compensate for that? And for the most part, for medical devices, it comes down to two things. Can I increase my monitoring, and can I isolate the device? Can I do segmentation? So if it were to be hacked, I've reduced the blast radius. But those are challenging given the diverse kinds of equipment, everything from implantable pacemakers, even pressure gauges that are the size of a paperclip perhaps, or the size of a key fob, to the big iron devices, the MRIs that are several tons, helium filled. It takes a forklift to do any kinds of changes on them. So the scope of understanding where all my risks lie is overwhelming. Automation, the ability to monitor network traffic, identify normal communication protocols, be able to have real-time reporting is a very tough thing to do. It requires a lot of strategic planning. You've got to have expertise. You've got to have advanced analytics on the monitoring side.
Joe, you've spoken in previous podcasts about how even very simple devices might have hundreds or even thousands of distinct software modules in their supply chain that could affect their security. How do you go about extending that software bill of materials management model to something as complex and as real-time as, say, a hospital?
If you can generate software bill of materials as you're producing the devices, the closer you produce the SBOM to the point you produce the software that goes on the medical device, the greater the accuracy of what the SBOM says is in that device with what is actually on that device. And so trying to keep that as close as possible and being able to communicate that for transparent reasons so downstream users know what's on those devices. And it gives people a chance to look at what the proper security measures or controls are.
And, from a detect and response, if you don't mind me jumping in here, think about Log4j.
I shouldn't laugh. Joe mentioned that a couple of podcasts ago because it's, if you like, the gift that keeps on taking.
So Log4j was a software component that had very broad applicability beyond medical devices. I mean, it was everywhere, but we didn't know where. So go back to 300 manufacturers. And that's just for medical devices. There's probably another couple hundred when we come to the other IoT or OT that's in a healthcare system, let alone all of the clinical applications, the risk systems, the radiology information systems, the lab information systems, the healthcare information systems. And it's not just SBOMs. I think we have to think about the life cycle of these devices. Things like the manufacturer's disclosure statement for medical device security, the MDS2, which is I call it a pre-flight checklist, but it's a checklist of controls that are available on medical devices. So there you can take the software, you can take the controls, and with the controls, you can understand what kind of hardening may be present on those. And given the kind of hardening, you can better assess, can I absorb this risk into my environment safely? And it's interesting because we've seen our actors change their tactics in response to the hardening that healthcare has put in. So those are all important factors as we do it. And it's going to take cooperation between the manufacturers and the healthcare delivery organizations to really have those meaningful conversations. And unfortunately, it has to take place technology by technology. Physiological monitoring is vastly different than clinical diagnostics. The big chemistry analyzers is vastly different than infusion pump technologies. And you can't apply things broadly across it all.
And I think that the point there is the information sharing, it's the dialogue, it's the conversation, it's the sharing of information between manufacturer and the user of the technology ultimately. And that is part of the point, Paul, is that enabling that transparency, what's on my device, and having that conversation so people are informed, and simply having the conversation helps to elevate what the security posture ultimately is.
Each side can very definitely help the other, can't they? It's not just a question of the purchasers of the devices will insist that some steps are followed and the manufacturers will follow. There's quite a bit of give and take from both sides.
I was going to say, one of the practices we had when I was in industry is when we found devices that didn't have the security controls that we would like to have, we would negotiate with the manufacturer and we would say, we would love to adopt this technology. We think it has great clinical benefit for our patients and for the population as a whole, but we cannot put it everywhere until you have these controls. Let's say we have access control or good authentication or maybe MFA. It helped manufacturers understand what we were doing. We weren't just saying no, but we weren't giving them the whole enchilada until they had proven their commitment to helping us protect our own infrastructure by providing equipment that was more resilient.
Because there is a point at which you can cut off your nose to spite your face, isn't there? If you suddenly say, right, there will be no more CT scans and no more MRIs in American hospitals until everything's rewritten in Rust or all the devices are replaced. Firstly, you can't afford to replace those devices. Even if you have the funds, you won't have the forklifts to move them in place. And secondly, they do perform a vital function that you can't really do without because they're such a useful part of modern diagnostics.
Correct. Our ability to provide unique care to each individual is becoming more and more of a reality. And with that, we'll have more and more technology. And a lot of that technology is embedded, and embedded equipment like infusion pumps, like patient monitors, like EKG carts, electrocardiograms. They're not a traditional Windows box. They have very limited resourcing, not much memory. A implanted cardiac pacemaker has a 7-year life. They're not taking it out to change the batteries. There's no way to plug it in to change the batteries. They have to put a power pack in there that will last 7 years. And so the resources available for those components has to be very small. And for that, you've got to be forward thinking.
So my understanding is that there are continuous developing changes in the FDA's regulations surrounding medical device cybersecurity. Of those, what do you think are the most promising changes that we've seen for both manufacturers and for users of the devices, and of course for the patients?
When Congress authorized or granted authority to the FDA for cybersecurity, taking on parts of the Patch Act back in December of 22, going into effect in March of 23. That was an important part because prior to that, the FDA didn't have statutory authority over cyber. They knew that cyber impacted device safety, but it was often a gray space and many times not a direct line. So it was a hard place for them to play.
So they were sort of still stuck in the past where they deal with, is this drug safe? Will this device put too many x-rays through your body? And not so much about what happens if anyone from a script kiddie to a Volt Typhoon wanders in and decides to do something nasty with it.
Correct. And the direct line between a device failing or being unavailable and patient harm, it's not an obvious thing. I've talked to a lot of doctors and technicians and nurses, and I asked them the same question. If a device were to fail in use, would you think about that cyber could be the cause? And every single one of them, to my surprise, has answered, I really don't have training in that area. I wouldn't know how to analyze it. If I were to take a failed device and hand it to a biomed, they would have by that time unplugged it, maybe plugged it back in. The whole application gets rebooted at startup because it boots right into operating mode. And the failure that happened may not be even detectable after the fact. Those are the design challenges we run against. I think with the changes that the FDA has, they've said you must use a secure software development lifecycle and think about the entire lifecycle. You must also consider the environment in which your device will operate. So not just the box that you sell, but you have to think this box is going to interface with my EHR or my risk system or my PAC system. And so what kinds of threats or vulnerabilities could those systems render to this? And do I have defenses against that?
These devices aren't sitting there in a vacuum, disconnected from everything else. These are highly interconnected devices. And so looking at the secure product development framework and using that to your advantage to understand, what do I need from an authentication perspective? What do I need from making sure I deploy or my devices haven't been tampered with? What can I do to ensure that I can prevent exploitation of memory vulnerabilities on these devices? But the fact that these devices are interconnected draws you back to having, as a product manufacturer, medical device maker, it draws you back to having a robust software development process and a secure product development framework. And with that, then you can systematically approach potential risk and do threat modeling and do other things that help you to really prioritize where you need to spend your efforts.
Joe, this reminded me very much of some of your comments when we spoke about security issues in the automotive industry, the first name that comes to somebody's mind would be Ralph Nader. Safety belts, airbags, crumple zones. It would not be what happens if someone hacks into my car while I'm driving along.
Well, I think in general, we've come so far in the industry. I go back to, say, 2015, and the FDA's gotten really serious about cybersecurity. And fast forward, look at what we've done in the past 10 plus years or so, developing regulations, developing standards, developing expectations. What do you need to do before you release a product? As a result of that, I think the industry has really come a long ways in those 10 years. It's a good thing because the point behind what you're saying ultimately is safety, and patient safety in a safe environment is ultimately the goal. And so cybersecurity is an enabler in that sense.
And we can't go back to the days of yore that we've spoken about in things like pump room controls, where we just assume that, hey, the device is going to be connected to a valve, it's going to be locked up in a pump room. That pump room was built in 1890 by Victorian engineers out of sandstone. No one's getting in there, so the device is going to be perfectly safe against hacking. That's absolutely not the case for almost any device, but notably, as Phil has explained, in the medical profession, where the average hospital is collecting more than 1 terabyte of data per day. I should have expected it, but it was still quite a confronting number when you mentioned it to start with.
Even a medieval castle, when connected to the internet, is not safe.
Yes.
But in this case, interconnected medical devices with all that data, with all the volume, there's good reason why we want to have cybersecurity on those devices.
And because so much of our ability to deliver healthcare much better than we ever have in the past is thanks to that connectivity where information can be shared and can be put into the cloud for processing in ways that the server under the desk in the cardiac unit never could have.
Right. I think the other element is, and I see manufacturers beginning to do this, is to separate the interoperability piece from the clinical functionality so that these devices can be A, more resilient, and B, faster to respond to. So if I can fix a communications vulnerability without touching the clinical side, that's much better. And medical devices are very expensive. A lot of them, they're 12, 15 years old. They're still performing the clinical function that they were originally purchased for.
Even with apparently infinite money, we still wouldn't have infinite time, particularly somewhere like a trauma centre, where they can't control the number of admissions that they might have. They can't predict that there might be a terrible accident that will need to give people urgent and immediate and careful attention. All of those things have to be balanced, don't they?
They do. And one of the things we haven't talked about is the impact on care. There have been studies, I think the first one was at Vanderbilt University, but several have been done that show that the clinical outcomes decline for a period of 18 months after a breach at an acute care center. The long tail, the distraction of staff, the extra processes to be put in place, the diversion of resources that would be applied to patient care that get redirected to securing the fortress, if you will. But the other one, and this was also done at the University of San Diego, Dr. Christian Demuth, who's an ER doc, but also a hacker.
That sounds like a dangerous mix. But I guess if he can use that for good, then hats off to him.
Yes, and white hats off to him all the way.
Yes.
He's an amazing gentleman. He did a study that showed when a hospital is hacked, it has an impact on every surrounding hospital in that community because they have to deal with the patient overflows that they're not prepared for, they're not staffed for, they don't have the supplies necessary for that. And so there's an impact on care outcomes, even in the surroundings. So the blast radius is not just your organization, the blast radius encompasses your community organizations as well.
And it's my understanding that the F in FDA stands for food, and the food industry for very many years has been regulated to tell us what ingredients actually go into the stuff they're selling us. So it seems quite obvious that this idea of a software bill of materials that goes into the stuff that we use for delivering healthcare is equally or perhaps even more important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it was 1969 that the FDA came out with its food labeling requirements. And so we suddenly knew what were in the cans and in the boxes. And they did this in response to it was a health driven issue.
And I thought you both were going to suggest that we needed to add cybersecurity controls to the food, and protect the next breakfast scramble. But I guess you weren't going to go there.
When they start cooking themselves, we will.
Perhaps I can finish up by putting a question to both of you and give each of you a chance to answer. For healthcare security professionals who've been listening to this episode, what do you think is the single most productive, actionable step that they could take right now to improve cybersecurity amongst their medical devices and their medical networks?
I would like to suggest that cybersecurity professionals working in healthcare systems engage the medical device makers and really ask about some of the controls and the requirements that are there, and to leverage software bill of materials and what they can receive from product manufacturers. I think that collaboration is ultimately the key. And if you look for a form of threat modeling to understand where are my biggest risk factors, what can go wrong, and have those dialogues in those areas, I think everyone's security posture will improve. And so naturally, I think software bill of materials play a role in that. But I think the broader picture is transparency, conversation, dialogue between supplier and healthcare provider. And when you do that, then everyone's security posture will elevate.
So there has to be a strong sense of community engagement between and amongst competitors, because no one of us can solve this problem on our own, can we?
And I think the visibility around the issues and the dialogue around the issues elevates people's preparedness to address some of them.
Transparency is the key, and understanding what you have. So there's a few elements that I would add to that. Some of them came out in the proposed rule changes to the HIPAA security rule, and that was have an inventory. If you don't have an inventory, then get one. And it's going to require tooling. There are a lot of good tools out there that can help you understand what those are. So that's number one. Two, that recommendation also included mapping your PHI end to end through your systems. Now, remember, a hospital operates more like a mall of specialty stores than a single homogeneous unit. You start at admitting and you go to the lab, or you go to the emergency room, and then you go to the operating room, and you go to pre-op and post-op, and then you go to therapy. And these are all independent specialties that use different technologies, have different specialists. And so while they appear to be linked by a chain, they operate very independently, although in the same family, if you will. So knowing where your data is moving, and even beyond your organization through and to all of your partners that go into this, all the external partners that you use, is key. I think the other piece is beyond transparency of knowing what you have, is negotiating what you can do and what you need help with. Another thing to consider is that 60% of the beds in the United States, the biomed devices supporting those beds, are supported by third-party organizations. So again, having a good framework to negotiate that support with your partners, whether they're the manufacturers, whether they're an independent service organization, or whether it's internally within your own organization, is essential to weaving a very tight tapestry of cybersecurity across this spectrum of tech.
So if you'll forgive me concluding with a cliche/truism, and as we've said in the podcast before, the thing about truisms, they become truisms because they are true. It sounds as though that saying that cybersecurity is best played as a team sport applies as much or more to the healthcare industry than anywhere else.
I don't know about anywhere else, but it certainly applies very strongly. The one last thought I would leave you with is 80% of anything is better than 100% of nothing. So get started where you can with the resources you have. Start with something small and teach you and your organization how to work through the rest of it.
Well said. Don't delay. Do it today.
Very good.
Phil and Joe, thank you so much for your passionate and thoughtful content. It's really great to see this kind of community spirit in the cybersecurity world. Thanks to everybody who tuned in and listened. That is a wrap for this episode of Exploited the Cyber Truth. If you find this podcast informative, please subscribe so you can tune in every week, and don't forget to share it with everyone in your team. Stay ahead of the threat. See you next time.